Chapter 17. Paul showed up to Zach's house, satisfied that if nothing else he now had the addresses of 2 members of the Proud Boys, though he assumed Ezra probably already had that from his time in the group. He was still coming to terms with what had happened at the dinner with the Libertarians. One racist Asian guy wasn't that surprising, but a table full of black and brown guys trying to push anti-Jewish conspiracy theories on him while defending secret Hitler was another. He was trying to spend more time in left-wing chats online to remind himself what he believed and why he believed it, but a lot of what they posted felt like empty platitudes after hearing about the global plan to pit the left and right against each other for world domination. He still wasn't sure how much of it to believe, but group chats that spent more time affirming transgender slogans and women's right to abortions than talking about the growing surveillance state that could be weaponized against them wasn't helping as much as he'd hoped. Zach answered the door, and Paul saw that Graham, Joshua, Kenji, Michael, and Richard were already all there. It seemed he, Gary, and DeAndre would be the last of the group to arrive, though they didn't seem to have any extra guests this time like last time. "At least one of the new fags came back," Zach said. "Were your friends scared that I'd make them take another shot on Malort?" Paul laughed. "I don't know, but, we don't have to, do we?" "No," Kenji spoke up, "but I think Gary's gay ass liked it. I'm surprised he's not back here begging for more." Zach added, "That faggot probably bought a bottle and is already drunk off it." Paul was pretty sure they didn't actually know Gary was gay, but that made it a little funnier. Joshua added, "Probably boofed it." Michael asked, "You need a beer?" Sure," Paul replied. He wasn't much of a beer drinker, but the beer they gave him the week before wasn't that bad. Zach said, "Give him a can of that piss water, gotta get rid of it." "I'm not gonna give him the tranny beer," Michael replied as he got up to go to the kitchen. Paul heard 2 female voices in the kitchen that sounded like Serena and Sophia. "Isn't Malort piss water?" Paul asked, remembering the horrible aftertaste. "No, Malort's way too strong to be piss water," Richard answered. "It just tastes like piss." Zach asked, "How would you know what piss tastes like, dick?" "What, you've never made a girl squirt?" Richard replied, and everyone laughed. Michael came back in and handed Paul a can of Warsteiner. He wondered why the group was so big on drinking German beer and hoped it wasn't primarily a Nazi thing, but he did admit that it was better than the typical brands like Bud Light he'd had before. There was another knock on the door, and Zach let Gary in. It seemed DeAndre would be the last to arrive again. Zach said, "Get this man a Malort!" "Whoa, were you trying to get me drunk so you can take advantage of me?" Gary asked with a smile. "In that case, I'll take 2. A few of the guys chuckled a bit at that. Michael said, "I'll get you a beer." "Thanks." Gary sat down next to Paul, which made Paul feel just a little uncomfortable. He felt bad about it, but somehow Gary being gay bothered him a little more while hanging out with this group. He tried to tell himself it was just because of the risk if they found out, or maybe because they were just making gay jokes a minute ago, but he still felt bad about it. Serena poked her head in from the kitchen. "Dinner's ready, dear." "You got yourself a well-trained wife, didn't you?" Joshua asked, and Zach smiled. Graham asked, "Damn, how'd you find one of the good ones?" Zach replied, "Shit, you're like 6'7". Don't act like you don't have bitches all over your nutsack." Graham corrected him. 6'4", and it's hard when you won't settle for a skank. Kenji suggested, "Import a border hopper from Mexico like Josh did." "Hey, Sophia was born here," Joshua replied as he headed for the kitchen. "She's as American as you or me." "Yeah, that's the problem," Graham muttered quietly enough that Joshua wouldn't hear him. Zach suggested, "Maybe Kenji can bring a wife over from Japan for you." Kenji replied, "No, our beautiful yellow women are much too precious to trade away to the lesser races." Joshua replied, "Funny, they all seem to be chasing white dick." "That's just what the media wants you to think," Kenji said. "Just like they want you to think white women all want black men, but nobody really wants to become a single mother with herpes." Most of the room laughed. There was another knock at the door. DeAndre had finally made it. Paul waved to him, but then headed into the kitchen to see what was available. It looked like there were 2 frying pans with ground beef in them, tortilla chips and tortillas with sour cream, tomatoes, onions, cheese, and jalapenos in bowls on the counter. "Help yourself to nachos or a burrito. This one's spicy. This one's just plain ground beef," Sophia told him. "Thanks," Paul replied. Part of him wanted to ask her why she was dating a racist, but after last weekend, he was afraid of what she might say. he decided to just make a spicy burrito, laughing to himself about the irony of eating Mexican food with a bunch of racists who oppose immigration from Mexico. As he was wrapping up his burrito, there was a knock at the door. He wondered who it could be, and as Michael opened it, he realized he'd forgotten about Daniel. The fat Proud Boy walked in and said, "Sorry I'm late, lost track of time." Zach scoffed. "Look at you, making the darky look good." DeAndre said, "Shit, cracker, there's more to life than being on time all the time." As he returned to the living room, he saw that DeAndre had taken his seat next to Gary, and he felt a little relieved as he sat in an open seat next to Kenji. "Be careful sitting next to Kenji," Daniel said. "His people are very isolationist." "Can't blame them for that," Paul replied. Even though he was obviously against their history during World War II, he was at least impressed that they had held off European colonialism longer than most other nations. Kenji added, "You guys could learn a thing or two from us." Zach replied, "If we had, you wouldn't be here." Kenji joked, "It's nice to know you love me too much to have borders or immigration laws." Paul swallowed a bite of his burrito. "At least the food is good." "Selling our people out for sushi and burritos?" Graham shook his head as he came back in from the kitchen. "We could just kick them out and keep the recipes." Joshua said, "We just need quality control so only the good ones can come here." Michael agreed. "Back when I was young and we actually enforced the law, we only got the good ones." "Yeah, and look where that got us," Zach said. "The good ones voted for people who let the bad ones in." "The Jews were going to rig things to make that happen anyway," Joshua said. "Blaming women and Hispanic people for what the Jews are doing doesn't get us anywhere." Richard asked, "You've been watching Europa again, haven't you?" "Hey, I'm a terrible white supremacist," Joshua replied. "My girlfriend's brown." Daniel added, "Never ask a white supremacist what race his girlfriend is." "Shit, my woman's white," Zach replied. "I don't know about the rest of you fags." "Your wife is white," Richard said. "What about your girlfriend?" Zach replied, "Don't say that so loud, fucker." DeAndre said, "Shit, playa, that's the danger of the game." Zach replied, "I don't even know what the fuck that means." Daniel joked, "I thought people were supposed to speak English in America." "We used to," Michael replied. "Long, long ago, back when the only immigrants we got were the good ones." "Another history lesson from Boomer Mike." Richard shook his head. "Sounds like ancient times long gone." Daniel joked, "Myth and legend, like a white supremacist with a white girlfriend." "You dating a darky or something?" Zach asked him. "About time you got some pussy." Graham said, "Probably a Jew, trying to one-up Josh by being an even worse white supremacist than he is." "Hey, those Khazar milkers are irresistible," Daniel said. "You ever see Abby Shapiro?" Graham said, "I'm not that desperate." Zach said, "Unlike you, he could actually bang a white girl if he wasn't gay." Gary asked Graham, "Gonna get yourself a boyfriend?" Graham replied, "Fuck no, I'm not gay." "Hey, it's not gay if you're the one on top," Gary joked, and Paul had to try not to laugh too hard. Zach countered, "It is if you get AIDS." "You guys talking about gay shit again?" Serena asked as she came in from the kitchen. "If I didn't know how hard I make you, I'd think you were gay." "Silly boys talking about all that gross stuff," Sophia said as she followed her in. "We'd better get out of here before they try to turn us gay." "Hot," Paul joked, and the two women made mean faces at him. Serena said, "Anyway, I'm gonna see if the kids are ready to go." "See, that's the kind of woman I need," Graham said. "A good cook who wants kids to love." "Thank you," Serena replied politely with a little curtsy before turning to walk down the hall. Graham asked Zach, "How the hell did a scoundrel like you end up with a woman like her?" "Well, you gotta start by not being a pussy," Zach replied. "Sometimes you gotta be a dick. Bitches love dicks." Graham semi-sarcastically replied, "Yeah, great advice." Richard replied, "It's true, though." "This advice may be outdated since I hear Zoomer girls are nothing like women back in my day," Michael said. "But if you treat a woman right, either she'll appreciate it or she's one of the crazy ones and you're better off waiting for a girl who likes being treated right." "I don't know if they make non-crazy ones anymore," Graham said with a sigh. "The crazy ones are more fun in bed," Paul said, though his experience with women was mostly one-night hookups or friends with benefits and not actual relationships. "You all better be talking about wholesome things," Serena said loudly before leading Zach's kids down the hall with Sophia behind her. Joshua said, "Mike actually did say something pretty wholesome a minute ago." "Good, more of that," Serena replied, then gave Zach a quick kiss. "See you in a couple hours." Zach gave his kids hugs while Sophia gave Joshua a kiss. "Don't cause too much trouble while we're gone." "Define too much trouble," Zach replied. Serena rolled her eyes while smiling and led the kids and Sophia to the door. "All right, gentlemen, let's march through the streets throwing Romans and shouting white power at minorities." As Serena shut the door, Kenji replied, "Did you say white powder? I support white powder." He raised his right arm in a Nazi salute. "White powder?" Joshua asked, excited. "Who's got the white powder?" He gave a sniff and rubbed his nose. "You crackers got Coke?" DeAndre asked, coming in from the kitchen with a plate of nachos. "We don't have any crack for you. Settle down," Zach replied. "We don't do Coke here. Some moral fag like this dude would report us to the feds." Zach gestured at Paul, who had only tried it once and didn't think the high was worth the come-down afterwards. Paul replied, "I've done it before." "Yeah, but have you ever done it out of another dude's butt crack?" Daniel asked, and Paul hoped he was joking. "I bet this fag has." Daniel motioned to Gary. "Only a couple times," Gary replied, and Paul wasn't sure whether he was joking, even though people laughed in response. "No butt crack lines. These new fags might actually do them," Zach said. "But I do have a joint swastika." As Zach pulled out a plastic baggie full of pre-rolled joints and laid them out in swastika shape, Paul started to have his doubts about his infiltration mission. They weren't finding out anything new about Secret Hitler, and he wasn't sure anyone there knew anything worth learning anyway. They weren't even talking about any potentially related theories like the libertarians the week before. He wasn't sure getting high on weed around Nazis with guns was a good idea either. What made Ezra think there was anything worth learning about here? Zach, Kenji, Joshua, Graham, and Daniel each grabbed a joint, and Gary and DeAndre each decided to grab one too. Richard and Michael seemed as uninterested as Paul was, so he moved to their side of the room. DeAndre and Kenji lit their joints at the same time, and after they each took a hit, DeAndre gave him a Nazi salute and said, "Nipper Heil Hitler," which made Kenji crack up and cough. Paul asked, "We don't have to take a hit, do we?" Michael replied, "Nah, I don't like doing it either." "Sounds like something a Fed would ask," Graham said, watching him with a look that made Paul feel uneasy. Richard said, "I don't like smoking weed either." Daniel said, "Feds can't do drugs. Everyone take a hit to prove you're not a Fed." Paul sighed and took a hit from Daniel's joint. He offered it to Michael, who held up his hand to refuse before passing it back to Daniel. "Ooh, Mike's a Fed," Daniel said, taunting him. Michael replied, "You're the one lusting after kike tits." Daniel asked, "What's wrong with conquering and colonizing the inferior races?" Graham replied, "Mixing with Jews is bad news." Joshua suggested, "So colonizing the natives is okay." "I mean, the natives didn't rape kids to blackmail politicians," Graham said. "They're too savage to subvert and destroy us the way Jews can." Kenji agreed. "Yeah, Jews are on a whole other level of evil." "Hey, I wouldn't be the first Nazi to fuck a kike," Daniel said. "Mike Enoch married one." Kenji pointed out, "Yeah, then she divorced him and took half his money." "You ever notice how weird it is that there were so many Jews and people close to Jews involved in the alt-right?" Graham asked. "Mike Enoch and his Jewish wife, Richard Spencer and his Jewish mentor, all the Jews who wrote for the Daily Stormer, Ron Unz. Like, isn't it weird that the two biggest racist news sites for years were both run by Jews? And the biggest racist podcast site was run by a guy who married a Jew? And Charlottesville was organized by a guy who was mentored by a Jew?" Michael replied, "I didn't even know all that." "I'd heard about some of that," Zach replied. "They're always subverting shit." Joshua asked, "Wait, if Mike Enoch was still working for them, why would his Jewish wife take half his money?" Daniel replied, "He probably just wanted to nut in the enemy, put their bitches in their places." Zach replied, "They use sex to control people, and they're kikes, so they'll screw their own people over for $1, just like they'll sell you your own opposition to them." "Yeah, that's what they do," Kenji added. "You know Robert Sepper is a Jew?" "Wait, what?" Graham asked. "The esoteric Christian dude making all these videos about how they've lied to us about history?" "Yeah," Kenji replied. "He even made a movie about the Holocaust with his Jewish dad, Ben-Hur Sepper. You can look it up. Dude started his publishing company as a Jewish publishing company. Full-on kike subversion. Fuck, I gotta look into that, Graham replied, pulling out his phone. The Daily Stormer's still based, though, Daniel said. They're constantly putting out great memes. Who cares if a couple of them were made by kikes? Dude, their webmaster is a kike, Graham said. And yeah, shit. Looks like you might be right about Robert Sepper. I thought he was a Holocaust denier. Guess he's just another subversive Jew. Is that handsome truth fag a kike? Joshua asked. I hate that guy. He looks like a Jew. I think he's just Mediterranean, Kenji replied, but he did do some Hollywood movies, and I think he has some other ties to Jews. Joshua said, he is kind of subversive, always starting fights with Christians over that pagay shit. Daniel replied, he's funny, though, better than Fuentes at making people laugh. They're both gay Mexicans, Zach said. Those are the only white supremacists the Jews will let us have. As Paul listened to them discuss all the Jews who had infiltrated the far right, he found it kind of shocking. He didn't recognize most of the names, but he'd heard of Richard Spencer and the Daily Stormer. Was there something to their concern? It didn't make any kind of straightforward sense for Jews to help create an anti-Jewish movement, but as he thought back to what the libertarians had told him about the way Jews tried to control many different sides and pit them against each other, he wondered if there was something to it. What about Proud Boys? Have there ever been any Jews in Proud Boys? Zach sounded mad. Shit, don't remind me. Kenji added, oh man, that fucking faggot. There's still a couple Jews in other chapters, Michael said, but we had to drive out the only one that ever joined ours. Zach said, that kike nigger Ezra was the gayest motherfucker you ever met in your life. Remember how he used to whip his dick out at meets? Joshua asked. That dude was seriously gay. Always super nosy, too, trying to get up in people's business even before getting to know them, Kenji added. I think that motherfucker was Mossad. Paul was surprised. Ezra had never mentioned being Jewish. He'd also given a completely different list of reasons for leaving Proud Boys, claiming he'd left because they were crazy conspiracy theorists, not that he'd been driven out for behaving weirdly. Did he really pull his dick out in front of a bunch of guys? Damn, that dude sounds gay as fuck, DeAndre said. But hey, more bitches for the rest of us, right? Oh, he went after the ladies, too, Michael said. That was even worse. One time I stopped by his place to drop something off, only to catch him cheating on his wife with some girl that I hope was 18, but I'm not sure she was. She mouthed off at him for something and he slapped her across the face. I almost beat his ass right then and there for hitting a woman in the head. Richard asked, why didn't you? I got heated with him, Michael explained. She grabbed her shit and left, and I told him I was gonna call Sharia on him and we'd settle it like men in front of all our boys. Never saw him again. I was about ready to call Sharia on him for asking me to front him a bag of weed and not paying me back, Zach said. He's lucky I never saw him again. Gary asked, you didn't go after him to get your money? His wife kicked him out later that week, Zach explained. Wouldn't tell us where he moved to. Good riddance to that ugly kike motherfucker. Never seeing him again is almost worth the weed he stole. Almost. The explanation of what had caused Ezra to leave Proud Boys hit Paul like a ton of bricks. None of them knew he knew Ezra, and none of them had any reason to lie. Michael didn't seem like he was exaggerating either, even if Zach might have been. He had come here expecting the group to be full of misogynistic woman-haters, and yet Ezra was the one who'd hit a woman, possibly an underage girl even, and cheated on his wife while Michael had been an upstanding enough man to try to protect the young woman from him. Paul realized that the confusion was showing on his face when he noticed Graham staring at him, but as he returned the look, Graham looked back at the other guys and acted like he hadn't just been staring. That unnerved him too. Not only was he worried about failing to uncover anything about Secret Hitler, he was now worried both about what was going on with the person orchestrating their entire infiltration campaign into the far right, and worried about whether Graham suspected anything. He made a quick decision to say something to hopefully make Graham less suspicious. Damn, that sounds like one fucked up kike. They just sound worse and worse the more I learn about them. Graham asked, you didn't know much about the kikes before joining Proud Boys, did you? No, Paul admitted. I mean, I'd heard a few things, but you guys all know so much more than me. It's been educational, at least. Like, damn. Yeah, kinda surprising to hear about all that, Richard said. Good thing he was before my time. I don't like woman beaters. He was before my time, too, Daniel added. Sounds like a gay faggot, though. The gayest of faggots, Kenji confirmed. I never liked him. Zack asked, not even his dick? Fuck no, Kenji replied. That mutilated little hoodless snake was pathetic. Oh, I thought maybe it'd make you feel better about how small your wiener is, Zack joked. Richard said, I'm just glad I haven't had to see any of your dicks. Kenji replied, and yet you make us look at dick every time we get together. I know, I'm a dick like that, Richard said with a smile. Guess that's why I've got a wife. Zack said, yeah, they do love dick. As they joked around, Paul took a minute to think about what he'd been told. Sending agents to infiltrate the far right was something he understood. He was basically doing that right now, and wondered if that was Ezra's real intention in recruiting him. But it sounded like they had been responsible for some of the biggest voices on the far right. Richard Spencer had planned Charlottesville, and supposedly Jews had been responsible for, or at least closely connected to, many of the biggest news and media sites and personalities on the far right. So, this might sound like a weird question, but why did the Jews do so much to help create the far right? Paul asked. I mean, you guys make it sound like they're controlling a lot of the biggest names in the movement, and have been for a while. Why would they spread anti-Jewish ideas? I don't get it. The guys looked at each other. Gary seemed a little uneasy. DeAndre looked confused, and Richard looked curious. Zack and Michael seemed impressed by the question, but unsure how to answer. Kenji grinned. Joshua looked like he'd never thought about it before. Graham smiled like he knew something the rest of them didn't know, and Daniel looked concerned, as though he hadn't thought about the implications of that. The question hung in the air for a bit before Kenji figured out how to answer it. There was a quote from Lenin that goes something like, "The best way to control your opposition is to create it yourself." Some of those people may have seemed like they were helping the cause, and even recruited a few people or spread the message somewhat, but many of them also embarrassed us or played into the enemy's hands. Charlottesville was a disaster that stole a lot of momentum from the far right. The Daily Stormer and Handsome Truth's followers have both done things that were used as excuses to pass hate speech laws that restrict our freedom to criticize Jews. Kinda like how the Jews controlled all the banks, Graham added. But then Karl Marx, a Jew whose cousin married a Rothschild banker, created the movement that said it was going to oppose the bankers, but really it enslaved the working class more than the bankers. Zack said, Man, I'm glad we have you two big brains to figure out how to explain all this shit to the new guys. Kenji proudly said, This is why the Jew fears the samurai. Paul wanted to get defensive about that. Communism was supposed to be all about workers' rights. It was supposed to be about opposing the bankers. Wasn't it? Those things weren't wrong, but was it possible that the cause had been hijacked? That it was created specifically to be hijacked? He didn't want it to be true, but after what he had just learned about Ezra, he had a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach that made him feel like he'd been getting used his whole life. He wanted to know how they were supposed to empower the working class and overthrow the greedy elites without communism, but he was afraid that any way he could try to ask that question would give away the fact that he was an infiltrator. Man, that shit is deep, Paul replied, shaking his head. It's a lot to think about. Those libertarian friends of yours that me and Dick hung out with last week gave me a lot to think about, too. Joshua joked. Heh, your dick was hanging out. Yeah, teabagging my brain, Paul said. Seriously, I thought I was starting to figure out what was going on when I joined, but it seems like I have a lot to learn. Zack asked, What were those dudes like, anyway? Well, half of them were chicks and half of them were brown, Richard commented, but they were pretty smart. They're deep into the conspiracy theory stuff, too. Yeah, Paul added. They seem to think the Jews are using Trump to enact some kind of techno-supremacist control grid scheme or something like that through Palantir, which I guess is some surveillance company named after the crystal ball from Lord of the Rings. Something they can use to crack down on all political dissidents, to know what we're doing before we can organize to stop them. I don't think Trump would give them that kind of power over us, Daniel said. He's not perfect, and he sucks too much kite cock, but he's still mostly on our side. Zack replied, I'm not so sure about that anymore. Yeah, the Jews wanted him in power, Graham said. Sounds like your anarcho-libertarian friends at least got that part right. I don't think Trump's totally controlled, Michael weighed in, but I do think the deep state and Jews have ways of pulling his strings more than the MAGA people want to admit. You new guys are being awful quiet, Zach directed the comment at DeAndre and Gary, but didn't seem to be directing it at Paul. We're not too hardcore for you, are we?
No, I'm just not caught up on all this stuff, Gary replied. I'm still kind of figuring out what to think about the Jewish guy you were telling us about earlier. What do you really think he was up to?
Whatever it was, he didn't last long or really do anything to stop us, Zach said. What about you, darky? I'm still kind of new to the Jew stuff too, DeAndre said, looking a little uncomfortable. I joined up because I love America. Gary nodded firmly when DeAndre said that. All this talk about infiltrating is some serious shit. You think that secret Hitler group is the same shit? Like, maybe they some kind of fake-ass group pretending to tell y'all what's going down, but really they setting up for that, what you call it, techno-supremacy control shit?
Yeah, that could be what's going on. Paul admitted to himself that it seemed just as likely to him now as the idea that they were actual Nazis.
Maybe they're just preparing to cause more riots and political violence, Richard suggested, as a way to justify police crackdowns and more surveillance. Puts the cops at risk too, and turns the people who are supposed to protect us against us. Really makes you wonder how far they're willing to go, Graham said, and what they're willing to do to keep people like us from doing anything to stop them. The way Graham stared at Paul as he said that last line made him feel sick to his stomach. He felt caught in the middle, unable to admit his suspicions about Ezra in front of Gary and DeAndre without knowing if they were still loyal to Ezra, and worried that some of the Proud Boys might be starting to suspect what their group was up to. Part of him regretted getting involved at all, but part of him worried that even if he hadn't, he would have been caught up in whatever the people behind Secret Hitler were planning anyway, and he still could be if he wasn't careful. Kenji said, "It really is weird just how much they get up to. Even some stupid things. Like, did you know the Jews were involved with the deadliest fart in history?" Paul laughed. "Wait, what?" Kenji nodded. "For real, over 2,000 years ago, after the Romans had taken over Judea, but before Jesus was born, a Roman soldier farted in front of the temple in Jerusalem, and the Jews started a riot that killed thousands of people over it." Michael replied, "Just because they say it was over a fart doesn't mean it was over a fart." Graham said, "Same shit, different century. If they want to start a riot, they'll find some fake and gay excuse like a literal fucking fart to start a riot." Paul asked, "Question is, why do they want to start a riot?" "Well, we're not going to figure out what those fags are up to tonight," Zach said. "Might as well do church." Joshua said, "Speaking of church, how are you handling the news about the murders?" Zach replied, "Shit, I was trying not to think about it. Lucius I could handle, still trying to decide what to think about the accusations against him. It's not the first time some shit has come up, but the money didn't seem like anything worth killing a guy over. That girl, though, that's rough. And if some of the rumors are true, then he deserved it. But who the fuck knows what actually happened at that church?" Joshua replied, "Yeah, I feel really bad for her family. It was kind of a shock. I know we've all heard about Secret Hitler in our news feeds and on streams and stuff, but having the murders touch our church, that's got me worried." Paul had almost forgotten Joseph mentioning that the two of them went to the church where recent murders took place. "That was your church? Did you know the victims?" Zach replied, "Some. Not great. The girl, Jessica, she was older than my kids, so they didn't really hang out, and I was never in choir, but she was really nice the few times we did talk. Lucius, well, he seemed okay, but if it turns out he was up to some shit, that'd say a lot about how you can't even trust the church blacks anymore." Joshua sighed. "I hope none of that shit turns out to be true, but the world is a filthy, tainted place that needs more Jesus." "What about beer? Anyone need another beer?" Michael asked as he got up and headed to the kitchen to get another for himself, coming back with a few more for the guys who'd finished theirs. Zach said, "Yeah, that way we can get to it." Zach gave a similar speech to the one he'd given a couple weeks ago, praising the virtues of Western man and expressing concern for the direction Western civilization was heading. They toasted the veterans, the entrepreneurs, the housewives, the First and Second Amendments to the Constitution, and a few other things, and restated their commitment to refusing to apologize for creating the modern world, with the caveat that they hated the parts of the modern world that had been created by their enemies. When the night ended, DeAndre and Gary were the first to leave. As Paul said his farewell, Graham did too and followed him out the door. As they walked to their cars together, Graham asked, "You're starting to come around on the Jewish question, aren't you?" Paul replied, "I mean, you guys make a lot of interesting points." Yeah, I thought so. Keep digging. The rabbi hole only goes deeper and deeper.